Okay. Hello all. Welcome to this lecture series by Professor Srinath from Brown. Professor Srinath will be here for this week and next, and he'll be giving a series of 5 lectures on visual computing, radiance fields in visual computing and AI. Srinath is an assistant professor of computer science at Brown University, where he leads the interactive 3D vision and learning lab. He received his PhD at Max Planck and was subsequently a postdoc at Stanford. He's broadly interested in computer vision and learning, and including visual understanding of 3D human physical interactions with applications in robotics and mixed reality. So he's a recipient of the NSF Career Award, Google Research Scholar Award, and his work received the Eurographics Best Paper Honorable Mention Award. So without further ado, I'll let Srinath talk about his work and help us learn more about radiance fields in visual computing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rajiv, for the kind introduction. First of all, it's great to be here. I've already been here a couple of weeks, and I've really enjoyed my time here. Thanks to the hospitality from you guys, and I'm really excited to be sharing some of the stuff that I've taught students at Brown. And I'm really excited to kind of share some of that stuff with you today. And the topic of the short course that I'm going to be teaching this week and next is radiance fields in visual computing and artificial intelligence. It's okay if you don't understand what radiance fields is. I will talk about what that is in a moment. Okay. All right. So before we begin, I'd like to understand a little bit more about the distribution of the audience here. How many of you are PhD students? Okay, some PhD students. Undergrads, do we have any undergrads here? Yeah, a few undergrads. Master students? Okay, most of you. All right. Any faculty? Yes, apart from, yeah, okay, all right. And how many of you have taken a course in computer vision or do research in computer vision? Okay, a fair bit of you. All right, cool, sounds good. Okay, so that helps me calibrate what I should talk about more, what I should talk about less, and so on. Okay. How many of you know what a radiance field is? How many of you know what NRF is? Neural radiance fields. Okay, that's good. All right. Okay, so this short course is going to be split across 5 parts. Today is part 1, where I'm going to be focusing on the fundamentals, the introduction. It's kind of structured as a history rather than as a boring list of technical things. So today I'm going to be showing you lots of videos. I'm going to be taking a kind of a trip down history or back in history, thinking about where radiance fields actually originated and what are the connections to radiance fields to all the other things that I'm going to talk about. All right. Okay, so lots of videos today. So hopefully that makes it fun. All right, so I'm going to play a video here, and I'd like you to think about what created this video. How do you think this video was generated? Okay, so here's the video. What do you all think? How do you think this video was generated or created? Drone. Okay, good. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Something like an outpainting.
Something like an outpainting, like generative AI, yes. Right? Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good. How about this one? I haven't yet told you the answer, so I'll come back to that in a moment. How about this one? It looks like some kind of hairdresser's shop. An abandoned one, perhaps. How do you think this video was created? Camera, using a camera. Maybe a person holding a camera.
Yeah. Maybe from a single image.
Maybe from a single image. Yes. That's advanced topics. We'll get to that in a couple of lectures. Yeah. All right. So what if I told you that both the previous video, so this one, as well as the hairdresser shop, the abandoned hairdresser shop video, they're not real videos in the sense that they've been generated using some kind of a digital representation, okay? No person took a camera and walked through this. Well, they did to capture some data, but this video was not created by a person holding a camera and creating a video, okay? This was generated using a digital representation of that space, okay? So radiance fields, this is kind of a teaser to what radiance fields are. Radiance fields are a way to create copies of our digital world, create digital twins of the world, right? It's one way to think about what radiance fields do, right? And these are the kinds of things that you can create from those digital representations. You can make it look like a person is walking. I mean, by the way, you don't see a reflection on the mirror.
Yeah.
Right? If a person were walking in that scene, you would see the reflection on that mirror. You don't see that, right? That should give you a clue about what this is, right? This is actually a digital representation. There is no real camera that created this, right? All right. So let me show you a few more examples. By the way, this is the digital twin of that particular scene, created in very high quality. This is what we call a radiance field representation. It's a digital representation of a real world scene, okay? And we can use this to render virtual cameras. So we can make it, we can try to figure out how that scene looks like from specific directions. And that's why you don't see the reflection there, right? But it's a completely digital copy, right? There is a real world counterpart to this, but that's not how this video is created. Okay. All right. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to yell in the middle. I mean, I'd like this to be interactive rather than one-sided. Okay, so feel free to ask questions if you have.
And how much is it grounded to the image, and how much is just like just creating something on the fly?
So this is all completely real. So this is not generative AI. So it's not hallucinating anything here. It's not generating anything that doesn't exist in the world. So this is a perfect digital representation of that real scene.
Which means there is an input in the form of an image from which we have started.
I will get to that in a moment. Yeah.
Earlier you stated that this was a generated video. Now,
well, it's generated, but it's not in the sense generative AI. Right? There's a difference there, right? So there is generative AI where you have a neural network that synthesizes pixels. That's not what this is, right? Although, we'll get to the details in a bit, but this is not, this is a copy of the real world. You could think of it that way. Just like, you scan a document, you get a digital copy of the document. It's like scanning the real world, you have a copy of the real world. All right. Okay, so here's a few more examples. This is another scene. Again, this is a real scene. And the way these digital copies are created is you take your smartphone or you take some camera and you take lots and lots of pictures of a real scene. So if you have a garden such as this is a real garden, by the way. But what you're seeing is not the real garden. It's a copy, this is a digital copy of the real garden, right? And the way you create these kind of digital copies is you take a lot of pictures. You take your smartphone camera, you take hundreds of thousands of pictures, and then you create these digital copies. And this short course is really going to be about how do we create these digital copies from images, right? So that's the point of this course. A few more examples. This is a child's nursery. You can kind of see, again, this is a digital copy. So you can go wherever you want. You can kind of see from whatever perspective you like, right? And you can see how things look like from different perspectives. Okay. Again, the definition of a radiance field, we'll get to that in a moment, but this is what the technology that creates this is called a radiance field.
what is the metric in the corner, sir?
The metric in the corner, this is frames per second. That's it's rendering at 120 frames per second, 111 frames per second. If you've used Google Maps, Street View in particular, you've probably seen fly-throughs like this, right? Where it allows you to kind of go through the streets, see how things might look like from different perspectives. This is San Francisco, the famous Lombard Street in San Francisco. In Google Maps, the technology that is being deployed to create these kinds of fly-throughs is actually radiance fields. Specifically, it's known as neural radiance fields, or NERFs for short, right? That's the technology that's being used to create these kinds of visualizations. All right. Okay. So far what we've seen is just looking at this digital representation from different perspectives, right? How would it look like if I were there? How would it look like if I was somewhere else, right? And so on and so forth. But this technology can go beyond that, right? It's not just about how things look like from different perspectives, but also what is the 3D shape of things. So for example, if you have a person, what is the shape of the person, right? So this technology can also be used to do 3D reconstruction. For those of you who've taken a computer vision class, you know that 3D reconstruction, you want to figure out what the shape of objects in the world are. And you can use the same technology to do 3D reconstruction as well. So here's a few more examples for faces and cats and so on. Okay. So far, I've shown you only static scenes, but the world is moving, right? All of you are moving around, moving your hands, moving your face, right? So we not only want to create digital copies of static environments, we also want to create digital copies of dynamic environments, right? So here's an example of some work that my lab did a couple of years ago. There's also audio. I hope this plays. Let's see. It does not. Okay. Anyway, the audio is not super important, so let me play that again. So what you're seeing here is the same digital representation, but this time it's a dynamic scene. So it's a person playing the drums, right? And you're looking at that dynamic scene from different perspectives, right? So you can see how that scene looks like from the bottom, from the top, etc., right? So essentially you're doing the same digital representation as before, but this time it is a dynamic scene. It's not a static scene. So here's one more example. This is a very recent example. It's called Long Wall Cap, this work. Here you can see again this person playing with the ball and the dog, but then this is a 4D copy. It's 3D over time, right? So not only can you can stop time whenever you like and look at that time instant from different perspectives, you can also play the whole sequence and look at it from different perspectives, right? So this is the same idea as before. You're creating a digital copy which you can view from any direction you like, but this time this is a dynamic version of the world. It's not a static version of the world. Does it make sense? Okay. All right, one more example. This is a real-time dynamic reconstruction using Radiance fields of a person. So you can see the person here. This is from a work called GPS Gaussian, and this person, and you have another person join him, and then what you see here on the right is again a digital replication, but this is a 3D digital replica using Radiance fields, so you can look at it from any perspective that you like. So again, you're creating in real time a digital copy of that person, a 3D digital copy of that person that is also dynamic. So as the person moves, the copy moves as well. So if you're interested in doing things like this, if you want to build methods like this, the underlying technology the state-of-the-art technology that's driving many of these methods is known as Radiance fields, right? And we're going to talk about all the details of Radiance fields in the next few lectures. Okay, so we talked about appearance, we talked about shape. Radiance fields capture all of this, but you can go even more steps further, right? So for example, here is a radiance field, a dynamic radiance field of a hand grasping some objects, right? So the hand is grasping the shoe, this bottle of moisturizer, right? But from this kind of radiance field, we can extract information such as, sorry, let me play that again. You can extract information such as contact points. So which part of my finger is in contact with which part of my object, right? Represented by this heat map over there. So whenever you see this bright red, it means that there is contact between the hand and the object. Right? So it's the same representation. It's the same digital copy that you're using for all of these different things. You're using this for viewing how things look like. You're using this to understand the 3D shape of the world. Now you're also using this to figure out where contact is made. Right? So as you grab a bottle to drink water out of it, right? Where does your finger make contact? This is very useful for applications in robotics and so on. Okay. Now, we can go even further, right? So here we have a static radiance field of a scene, but then we can ask questions like, where is the Lego bulldozer, right? Now, what is happening here is this radiance field is interfacing with something that resembles ChatGPT, right? Like a large language model, a large vision language model. So what's happening here is that vision language model, so generative AI, is combined with this radiance field so that you can now ask questions like, you lost your keys in your room. You don't know where your keys are. Where are my keys? Right? So something like this could potentially help you do that. Right? So again, the underlying technology is the same technology. It's this digital representation, digital twin that we call radiance fields. Okay? All of these examples that I've showed you so far use this radiance fields as the underlying digital representation of the world. All right. Any questions so far?
So
Yeah.
You say digital representation, but most of these applications revolve around like visual representation, right? To like someone.
Well, what I mean is the representation is stored digitally,
Okay.
right? So that's what I mean by digital representation. Yeah.
Dynamic environment or dynamic reconstruction. how much, like, how do you say, what is the dynamic? Like, how much dynamic is dynamics? Like, what is the velocity or speed?
Well, anything moving we consider it to be dynamic.
Yeah, but how fast it can move to reconstruct it better? How do you study that?
Oh, that really depends on the kind of methods that you use. So different applications have different needs. Let's say you're doing construction work, right? There, you're probably not interested in reconstructing the dynamics in real time. Whereas if you're doing something like playing the drums, then you want to construct things at 30 frames per second, right? So it really depends on the application. But by dynamic, we simply mean that the scene is changing and you're trying to reconstruct. Okay, cool, yeah.
Probably jumping hoops, but what role does occlusion play here?
Yeah, so as I said, the way we create this digital representation is we take a lot of pictures. And by a lot, I mean like hundreds of thousands of pictures, right? So when you do that, occlusions get reduced, right? So in the pure version of this kind of reconstruction, you assume that there's no occlusion. Everything is fully observed.
Okay.
Right? But we will talk about advanced topics later, where we talk about what if you have only one view, right? Can we do this completion and so on? And there you need priors from models, for example, generative AI models. Right?
So I wanted to know, like the playing drum scene as well as touching this thing, are they? I mean, the 3D versioning were made separately, and then you superimpose them to see the contact, or were they touched and then you click the photo?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about this method later. But there are different versions again, right? You can either do it later or you can do it together, right? But we'll talk about this later.
It is at least structure from motion or slab. This is the new.
Yeah, I'll talk about that as well. So we'll discuss how that. When I talk about the history, we'll discuss that. Yeah.
Can this be used to sense depth from a 2D image taken from what?
Not so. Again, as I said, this assumes that you have a lot of image observations. So if you have a lot of cameras, this works well, right? When we don't have too many cameras, then we have to fill in the gaps, and we will talk about that later.
So
Yeah.
in that dynamic environment, there were persons in the background also. Were they also moving? Were they also captured?
Yeah, but not very well. So let me. You're talking about this video, right?
This will be.
I think there's people here, right? Yeah, they're being reconstructed, but there's not enough cameras near them, right? So again, if you're familiar with signal processing, you have a signal, you're sampling that signal essentially, right? You have to sample it sufficiently enough if you want to reconstruct it, right? In that case, there's probably not enough cameras sampling those people, right? So you may not be able to reconstruct them as well. All right. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so for now, we're not going to dive into too many technical details in today's lecture. It's going to be fairly high level. But it's useful to understand what a radiance field is, right? So I'm going to define a radiance field first. Don't worry too much about this definition. Radiance, we'll talk about that at the end of lecture today. But a radiance field is a 5-dimensional function that describes how light interacts with the scene and how much light energy passes through a given point in space. Okay? And it turns out that this has deep connections to computer graphics and specifically the rendering equation, which we'll talk about later. But I think at this point of time, it's useful to think about the radiance field as modeling two things. Okay? The radiance field gives us a sense of the appearance of the scene. So how this scene looks like, this digital representation of the scene looks like from different perspectives, that we call appearance, right? So that includes how bright is that light? What color is that light? What color is your t-shirt? Right? Things like that. Okay? That's what we mean when we say appearance. And then it captures some notion of 3D shape. So that's what is the geometry of things in the world. What is the shape of this chair? What is the shape of the camera? Right? So things like that. So those are the two things that are being captured by a radiance field. Right? So that's all the applications that I showed you before. When we change the viewpoint, the appearance changes. But then the viewpoint also gets affected by the geometry of the scene. Right? So what the radiance field captures is how the appearance changes as I move, how the geometry changes in different parts of the scene. Right? So it captures all of this information. Okay, so as I said, this is going to be a 5-part course. We are here today. And today is mostly going to be lots of fun videos in history and introduction, maybe a little bit of a few equations here and there. And then in part 2, we're going to dive deeper into specific radiance field techniques. So on Wednesday, we'll talk about NERF, which is neural radiance fields. On Friday, we'll talk about 3D Gaussian splatting. And next week, we'll talk about specific applications, focusing on things like grasping, perhaps, or maybe the semantic understanding. And then finally, we'll talk about like what's the cutting edge, what's like the most recent methods, and what is the cutting edge, what are solved problems, what are unsolved problems in this area. So that's where we'll conclude. There's also some homework exercises for those of you who are interested. It's going to be a fun homework exercise. There's going to be one today. It just involves you taking pictures and uploading it to a website. But in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about perhaps you want to get your hands dirty and code yourself, right? So you can do some of that stuff if you're interested. All right. Okay, and much of the material that I'm going to talk about today has been borrowed from various folks. They're listed here on the slide. And also what I'm going to mention, represents a sampling of work. This is not meant to be like a literature review, right? For those of you who may not be familiar, research in this area is really goes at a very fast pace. So papers are published every single day. There's probably like tens of papers every single day. I'm not going to cite all of them here, right? I'm going to sample just a few papers. This is not meant to be a review, just FYI, but I'm happy to point you to the right places later. Okay, so let's think about appearance and 3D shape, right? So those are the two things that the radiance field is actually capturing. It's useful to think of the radiance field as capturing these two things, right? Now, when we talk about appearance, let's go back in time, okay? What is the biological organ that we all have that captures appearance? Let's start there. So let's go back 500 million years ago, right, from today. Let's start there. So about 500 million years ago, some of the first biological eyes started to evolve. So we had proto-organisms that had cells that were photosensitive, right, and they could sense bright lights versus dark lights and so on and so forth, right? So that's where it all started. And you could think of these biological eyes as, ways of measuring appearance of the world, right? So that's what our eyes do, right? So we have eyes. The eye tells us the color of things that are in the world, the appearance, how bright or dark things are, right? So that's what the eye does. And, we have a very specific structure. Different animals have slightly different structure. Different animals see the world slightly different, okay? Now, we also have two eyes. Some animals have more, some have less, but as humans, we have two eyes, and this is useful for depth perception, so how far away things are, right? And that is related to shape of the world. So again, shape and appearance, right? Each eye tells us something about the appearance of the world. Both eyes together tell us something about the shape of the world. Right? So that's the analogy here, right? So that's how biological evolution has designed these kinds of sensors. Right? So that's 500 million years ago. Maybe a quick anecdote. So if you look at the response of the human eye, like what wavelengths we respond to the most, it turns out that there is a very high peak in the green wavelength. Anyone have an idea why that might be the case? Vegetation. Could you elaborate a bit more?
Probably we evolved in forests. We were seeing a lot of green, and you had to distinguish between those.
That's right. Yeah. So humans, we were probably on trees at some point, right? Trees have a lot of green leaves, and we had to distinguish different shades of green, right? So it was really important for us to have good acuity in the green wavelength. That's why the human light response curve kind of looks like this, right? Why is this relevant? I'll talk about this in a moment. This is relevant when we design digital cameras. So when we talk about digital cameras, we'll see why how this is related to that. Okay. By the way, different animals have different reflective properties. Some animals don't see green as well as we do. The other day I was reading somewhere that deer don't see orange. So if there's a tiger or a lion, shades of yellow and orange, apparently they just blend into the background because deer don't have that capability. That's why, So different animals have different properties. All right, so that's how nature allows us to record appearance and shape, right, through biological eyes. But then at some point, humans started to get smarter, right? And we started to record things, right? So recording stuff by sketching something is a way of, capturing the real world appearance. Right? So you can think of this as a primitive form of digitalization, except this is not digital. You're making symbols, you're making sketches of the real world. Right? So for example, this is one of the first known cave paintings 51,000 years ago, right? So it depicts multiple people and some kind of a pig-like animal, right? So if you think about this, is a very primitive way of recording appearance of the world. So you're looking at the real world. There's probably some people and then an animal, and you're using your hands to kind of sketch this on a cave wall, right? So you're recording the appearance and shape, rough shape of the real world using this kind of a painting. Right? So that's where it all started, right? That's how we record these appearance and shape of the world. And then, we kind of continue. At some point, humans don't really limit ourselves to small scenes. We start to sketch things that are much larger. For example, this is one of the first known maps. Apparently, this is a map of some kind of a precinct or a city. It's a very rough sketch, but it kind of shows demarcation boundaries of different things that are in the city, right? And again, this is a way of capturing the shape of the city, right? Capturing the rough appearance of the city, right? So that's what we are doing by doing something like this. Remember, this is in 4,000 years ago almost, right? So this is much before we had cameras, we had smartphones, we had easily accessible ways of creating digital images of the world. This is a little more recent, from about 500 years ago. This is apparently a navigation chart used by the Portuguese when they were trading with India. And this kind of looked like this, right? So you kind of see a rough shape of, over here you see a rough shape of the subcontinent. It's not really very accurate, right? But it is a rough shape that they used for navigation purposes and so on and so forth, right? So even 500 years ago, although we had things like paper and ink and so on, right? It was not very easy for us to record appearance, right? So we had to rely on lots of approximations, and this is how it looked like 500 years ago. But technology evolves. It's not just technology doesn't just mean computers, right? Pen and paper is technology, right? Using tools to make better maps is also technology. For example, there was in the 1800s, there was this survey done by the East India Company. It was started by the East India Company. They did a survey of the entire Indian subcontinent. It's called the Great Trigonometric Survey of India. So they wanted to go from maps that look like this to maps that look much more accurate, that look like this, right? And the reason for this, of course, was that they could collect better taxes, etc. Right? So this was not necessarily a entirely scientific endeavor, but nonetheless, this project, which actually started not far from here in Chennai, actually, this created very accurate maps of India. But also it made some scientific contributions. So for example, it managed to figure out the curvature of the Earth because India is quite big, right? So if you measure the whole country very accurately, you know how curved the Earth is, right? The Earth is not a perfect sphere. It's, I think, an oblate ellipse, a spheroid or something like that, right? So they kind of figured that out using this kind of survey, right? They also made advances in logarithmic tables. So if you probably haven't used log tables, I was still using it when I was in high school. But log tables actually were perfected using surveys like this, right? Because in these surveys, they had to do a lot of math, and it was just easier to create these log tables as lookup tables, right? So there were some important scientific contributions through surveys like this, right? And actually, if you go to, anybody from Chennai here? Yeah. One, maybe. All right. So if you go to St. Thomas Mount in Chennai, there's actually a statue, which is where it all started. This is the statue of William Lambden, who started this whole survey. There's a very statue in one corner of that hill. If you go there, if you're interested. By the way, the person after William Lambden who managed this project, his name was George Everest. Or more commonly now we call Mount Everest, right? So he was the first person who measured how high Mount Everest was, right? His actual name was George Everest. He succeeded William Lambden in this project. Anyway, it's a bit of a detour from Radiance fields, but my point here is that we've been trying to capture appearance of small things, big things, the shape of big things, shape of small things for a very long time, right? And I kind of see radiance fields as a kind of natural progression in the digital realm today for doing the same things. Okay, all right. Question.
This seems to be the grandpa of the Hinton.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
The E for Hinton stands for invest.
I did not know that. There's an interesting connection. Yeah, I will look that up for my next presentation. Yeah. All right. So, anybody know what this is? Okay. So it looks like it's some kind of a room or a building next to the sea, and it says Camera Obscura on it. I don't know what that is. If you look on the other side, by the way, this is a building that's in San Francisco. It says Giant Camera. So why would they call this room a Giant Camera? It's a bit weird, right?
It's a large pinhole camera.
Yeah, exactly. So you guys are ahead of that, right? So it is actually a camera. So the word camera actually comes from the Latin root camer, which is shared through many languages, including Hindi. I don't speak Hindi very well, but camera, I think, is also room, right? So it has the same root word as camera, right? So when we say camera, I mean, why are we talking about cameras? Cameras are tools that we use to capture the appearance of the world, right? So that's why we're talking about cameras. And cameras actually started off like this, right? They were big rooms. They were literally rooms, right? That's why they're called cameras. They're like these big rooms. So some of the first cameras look like this, right? So they were pinhole cameras. I think most of us know what pinhole cameras are. Like you have this room here, you make a small hole, light passes through that hole, creates an image on the other side of the wall, right? So that's a pinhole camera. And some of the first cameras were literally just rooms, right? Where you would make a hole on one wall, it would create an image on the other wall, right? That's why they are called cameras, because they were literally big rooms. Of course, we now have we have 4 cameras that fit inside your pocket, right? So it'd be really inconvenient if you had to carry around the room everywhere you go. So people wanted to shrink it, right? So there was lots of technological advancements, just like we go from laptops that are 2 inches thick to like half an inch thick, right? It's kind of a similar thing there, right? So you go from rooms to small boxes. This particular camera was called Camera Lucida. And the idea here was this had a lens, by the way. The lens is really the key to making cameras smaller. If you have a lens, you can take light from a really broad angle and then focus it on a specific area, right? So this had a lens, which allowed the camera to be much smaller. And then it would create an image there, which an artist would then sketch over, because they didn't have photosensitive film yet, right? So they would manually sketch over the things, right? So again, this is a way of capturing appearance. And then somebody invented photosensitive film. This is actually the first photograph that was ever taken in 1826. The original is actually at UT Austin. That's on my bucket list when I go to Austin next. But this took 8 hours to expose, right? So imagine you had to put the camera, wait for 8 hours. 8 hours later, you have an image, right? Compare that to how many photos you can take in 8 hours these days. So yeah, that's where it all started, right? So we now had tools, we had the technology to take the appearance of the world, capture it in a way that just stays there, right? Using this photosensitive film. And then, of course, in the 50s, this technology continued to develop, and then we have this, right? Anybody who's used this before? Only a few. So, when I teach my class, I ask this question every year, and every year it goes down by 10%, right? So, I expect in like 5 years, nobody knows what this is, right? So, this is, of course, a film that was widely used probably like 20, maybe more, 30 years ago. You had to put the roll on your camera. You had 36 pictures. You couldn't see how the picture turns out. You had to take pictures, trust the whole thing, and then go to a photo studio where they would take 3 days to develop your photos into actual printed photos, and then fingers crossed they came out right. And oftentimes they didn't, right? So that's how things worked back then. All right. So obviously, that's not where we are. Technology continues to evolve, right? And in the 90s, we started seeing the first commercial digital cameras, right? And commercial digital cameras are better because we don't have an analog copy of the world. We have digital copies. By this time, computers were really mature, right? So we want zeros and ones so that we can manipulate these digital representations very easily, right? So again, just to draw an analogy between this, which seems somewhat far away from radiance fields, right? Effectively, radiance fields are also zeros and ones. They're digital copies of the 3D world, whereas what digital cameras produce are digital copies of just an image, right? It's just one perspective, right? So that's how I would think about it. But anyway, so digital cameras have photosensitive devices. These are very small micro devices that are sensitive to certain wavelengths. They kind of look like this. So here you can see in front of every photosensitive device, there is some kind of a filter. And you can see that there's lots of green filters, some blue filters, some red filters. Right? Why do we have more green filters? Any idea? Yeah, exactly. Right. So it goes back to biological evolution of the human eye. We are more sensitive to green, right? So therefore, this filter also has more lets in more green. But that doesn't mean the image looks green, right? So there is a process known as debayering or demosaicing that we do to transfer this to images that we can then look on displays and so on. So that's how digital cameras work. So effectively, there's some kind of a micro device that is photosensitive to light. When light of a certain wavelength hits it, there's a signal, and then you record that. Right? You record the intensity and so on. Okay. All right, so now we're going to, in parallel to the whole capture thing that's going on, computer graphics is also progressing, right? So in the 70s, people were kind of building the first animated meshes. If you've ever seen a Pixar movie, right? Everything that you see in a Pixar movie is what is known as a mesh. It's kind of a computer graphics way of representing the world, and the mesh is animated and so on, right? But then in the 70s, that didn't exist yet, so people had to invent it. So this is how they created a mesh back then. So they actually, had a plaster cast of a hand. They put points on the hand, and then they had this big device, which you will see in a moment. So they had lots of points on the hand, right? And then they used the model was digitized. How did they digitize it? They had this device, which had a pointer here. And you had to put that pointer next to each point on the hand, and it would tell you the XYZ coordinates of that point. So effectively, they're measuring the shape of the hand, right? So again, appearance and shape. So here they're measuring the shape, right? So they get all of these points, connect all of those points into triangles, and what they get is a mesh. Right? This is called a triangle mesh. If you've taken a computer graphics class, this is the fundamental building block of many things we do in graphics. Right? Once you have the triangle mesh, you can then add appearance on top of it. So this is known as smooth shading. How does the hand look like when it is lit under different lighting conditions, when it's seen from different perspectives? You see all the shadow here, all the different lighting here, and so on and so forth. Right? Things that we take for granted today when we watch an animated movie. Right? Somebody had to invent all of this, painstakingly mark every single point on the hand. And then you can animate it. Right? So this was done by Ed Catmull. For those of you who don't know, Ed Catmull is or was the president of Pixar Animation Studios, right? So he's the person who's leading the whole Pixar Animation Studios today. All right. So again, in parallel to all of this, the medical imaging folks are also making progress. They're interested in identifying diseases, diagnosing people, right? And they want to look into people, right? Without having to cut through them and so on. Right? So how do they do that? They create these sensors, which are effectively not using visible light. They're using X-ray or some kind of magnetic resonance imaging, right? So they can peer into the body without actually having to cut through it, right? And they create like 3D copies of the tissue and the organs inside your body, right? Without actually having to cut through this, because X-rays can penetrate skin, penetrate lots of tissue, right? So you can, this is the kind of technology that you use to create 3D copies of the insides of people, right? So they're also making progress in parallel. And this technology actually is very much connected to radiance fields, as we will see next. It's known as computed tomography. There's lots of connections to computed tomography and radiance fields, as we're going to talk about it soon. All right, again, computer graphics is progressing as well. In the 80s, something very, very important was, I guess, invented. This is known as the rendering equation. The rendering equation is really, really fundamental in computer graphics. We're not going to talk too much about this, but essentially what the rendering equation tells us is if you have a point in your digital representation of the world, let's say that point is X over here, the rendering equation gives you a relationship between the light that is emitted from this particular point with respect to everything else that is in the scene. So that includes light sources, it includes the material properties of things, it includes the reflectance of other things, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's what the rendering equation tells us. Again, if you watched a Pixar movie, it wouldn't be possible without the rendering equation. Right? So you need to know this exactly in order for you to create images in computer graphics. Okay. And again, there's this long history where people discover similar things in different communities. Right? So there's also the photogrammetry community who are really interested in making maps of the world. So remember the first map that I showed you, this really rough sketch of a city, right? So people are trying to do this in the 70s, except that they're now using advanced technology. So they're flying airplanes with cameras, right? And then they want to use the images that are taken by the cameras, which is what you see here, to create a 3D map of the world. Right? So most of Google Maps was created using photogrammetry, right? So some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, the NERF, the flight through in San Francisco, that is radiance fields, but most of Google Maps is photogrammetry, right? So photogrammetry tells us how do I use images to create maps of the world, to create digital copies of the world, but those are not radiance fields. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay. In the computer vision community, people are also inventing technology to reconstruct the world, to reconstruct the shape and appearance of the world. Specifically, there is this method known as structure from motion. Structure from motion is a technology that is used to create, very similar to radiance fields, to create a digital representation of the world, of the shape of the world, the appearance of the world, something that looks like this, right? So for example, in this video, which should play in a moment, they take pictures that tourists have taken in Italy, and they merge all of those pictures together using structure from motion to create 3D digital copies of the Colosseum. Right? So this is a digital copy. It's not a radiance field. It's what is known as a point cloud. Right? So there's lots of millions and millions of little points XY that have an XYZ position, and they have a color. Right? They create this kind of digital copy using this technology called structure from motion. Right? Yeah.
How is that point cloud rendered into the final image though?
Yes, they use something known as splatting. We will talk about that that has some loose connection to 3D Gaussian splatting. Yeah.
How is this similar or different to that work of building Rome in a...
It's quite related, yes. Yeah. Okay. They use structure from motion as well in building Rome in a day. Okay. Yeah. And in parallel to the computer vision community, the robotics folks are also inventing similar technology. So this is known as simultaneous localization and mapping, or SLAM for short. SLAM is a technology that is used to localize robots in an area, right? And in order to do this, they would actually reconstruct the entire scene. They would reconstruct mostly the shape because the roboticists didn't care too much about the appearance. So they would create something that looks like this. If you've seen any self-driving car, they have, self-driving cars have this LiDAR on top, right? So there is a kind of depth sensor that would create this kind of a point cloud. This is not LiDAR, it's using SLAM, but this is the kind of digital representation of the world that self-driving vehicles use to navigate and so on. Yeah.
What's the difference between radiance field and point cloud?
Yes, we will talk about that in a moment, but at a very high level, they are completely different representations. Point cloud, radiance fields are richer in terms of the kind of appearance that you can capture, potentially even richer with respect to geometry and so on. So it's like, two different ways of representing the same thing. Okay, and then in the early 2010s, we started to see the proliferation of depth cameras. Depth cameras I don't know, anyone know the Kinect? Yeah, a few, okay. So the Kinect was one of the first commercial depth cameras. This was a device that you could buy. It's kind of like the Xbox kind of thing, right, where you buy, put it in front of your television, you can move in front of this device and it could track you, right? And the way it did this is by measuring how far away things are, right? That's why it's called a depth camera. So rather than sensing just the appearance as cameras do, it can also sense how far away things are, right? And it creates what is known as a point cloud, something like what you see here on the top right. So that point cloud is something that you can use to figure out not just how things look like, but also what is the shape of things. Right? So shape and appearance, the two things that keep coming up over and over again as we go through this history of ways of representing the world. I mean, these days depth cameras are mostly, you don't see them often, except that if you have an iPhone, I think you have a depth camera in the iPhone. Even that is probably going to be phased out in the near future. All right. Which finally brings us to the 2020s, where we are. And in the year 2020, we had this new technique known as neural radiance fields that kickstarted, or I guess restarted the renewed interest in this radiance field representation. And what you're seeing here is some old results. We'll look at more newer results here, but that's where we are today, right? So there is a lot of interest in representing the world, both small scale as well as large scale, using this representation because it better represents the appearance of the world. Sometimes if you do it right, it better represents the shape of the world as well, right? So you don't have to deal with depth cameras, which can be expensive, noisy. You don't have to do structure for motion, which tends to be sparse. So the reconstructions that you get from a point cloud, such as this, they're not very dense. So there's points only in certain places. Whereas radiance fields can give you a very dense representation. Right? So that's why this has become something that people really care about these days.
Can radiance fields also work with LiDARs and other sensors, or only cameras?
Depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on how you're building the radiance fields. Sometimes having LiDAR can help easily build your radiance field. But if you have enough cameras, you probably don't need that. But we'll talk about all that in the next lecture. Okay, how am I doing on time? Maybe I'll do like 5 more minutes and then I can wrap up for today and we can continue on Wednesday. Actually, let me see if maybe I should move this to the next lecture. Give me a moment. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here. But there's one more thing, which is the homework assignment. So let me do that.
Meanwhile, I have a question.
Yes.
How is the radiance field different from a light field? Or is it?
They're all related. A light field is a more complete representation.
Okay.
A radiance field, that's what the slide is about, but we'll talk about it in the next lecture. But a radiance field is not, doesn't capture the entire planoptic function, whereas a light field does. Yeah. But that's probably going to be the first thing that we'll talk about in the next on Wednesday. But before we conclude, maybe a homework assignment for those of you who are interested. So this is my wife's bicycle, which she was trying to sell. As a computer vision researcher, I couldn't just post photos, so I had to create a 3D model. So I created a 3D model of her bicycle so that it would sell for a higher price. And this is what I created. So I took maybe like 50 pictures of the bicycle, and then I ran it through an online tool called Luma.ai. So you can find the link over here. So what I'd encourage all of you to do is maybe today, after the conclusion of the lecture today, maybe you can take a bunch of photos of whatever object you'd like, and then just upload it to this website. You can create a free account. They will create your radiance field for you, and by if you upload it tonight, it should be ready in about an hour, and maybe you can share this on Wednesday. So that's the homework assignment for those of you who are interested. All right, with that, we'll conclude here, and the next lecture is going to be on neural radiance fields. Thank you. Yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to stick around. Please feel free.